Most species scream by the sixth strike. The human smiled at 19. The detention chamber vibrated with the low mechanical hum of the Carvax warship as crimson warning lights pulsed across the black steel walls like a heartbeat. Cold air hissed from overhead vents. The smell of burnt circuitry and sterilizing chemicals clung to everything. Chains rattled softly in the center of the room, where Ethan Cole hung from a reinforced magnetic restraint, his boots barely touching the grated floor beneath him. Sweat soaked through the torn collar of his gray prison uniform. A thin streak of blood traced down the side of his jaw before disappearing beneath the harsh white glow of the interrogation lamps overhead. Around him, armored alien soldiers stood in silence, their gold-visored helmets reflecting every movement like polished mirrors. One of them checked a datapad and let out a nervous clicking sound. Cardiac rhythm remained stable, the soldier muttered. That should not be possible. General Valora Threx stood motionless near the observation glass, nearly 8 feet tall beneath the chamber lights. Her dark blue skin carried a faint metallic sheen, and the silver lines embedded along her military armor glowed softly with each breath she took. Calm, controlled, untouchable. At least that was how she appeared to everyone else on the ship. But her golden eyes remained fixed on the human prisoner in front of her, and for the first time in years, something unfamiliar crawled beneath her composure. Irritation, curiosity, maybe even unease. Ethan lifted his head slowly. One eye had already swollen half shut, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward anyway. You know, he rasped, voice dry from dehydration, Earth football practice was worse. A few alien guards shifted uncomfortably. One actually stepped back. Valora narrowed her eyes. Your humor serves no purpose here, human. Ethan coughed lightly before looking directly at her. Yeah? Neither does beating a dead guy. Good thing I'm still alive. The room fell silent again except for the soft hum of the ship's engines somewhere deep below the deck plating. Valora studied him carefully. Human physiology. Reports had warned her species about Deathworld natives. Extreme endurance. High pain tolerance. Aggression responses beyond galactic norms. But reports were numbers on a screen. Ethan Cole was different. Real. Breathing. Bleeding. Still standing after 19 neural strikes that would have permanently shut down the nervous system of almost any known species. One of the younger officers approached carefully. General, permission to continue? Valora did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained on Ethan's wrists where the magnetic restraints had rubbed raw against his skin. The human's pulse visibly pounded beneath the surface, steady and stubborn, refusing to weaken, refusing to surrender. Finally, she stepped forward, boots echoing sharply across the metal floor. The soldiers instantly straightened. Ethan watched her approach through strands of sweat-damp brown hair falling over his forehead. Up close, Valora seemed even larger. Her armored frame blocked part of the interrogation lights behind her, casting a shadow across him. Your fleet codes, she said calmly. Give them willingly, and this ends. Ethan breathed slowly through his nose. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just tired, honest. Lady, he said, if humans gave up every time life hurt us, we'd still be hiding in caves. Something shifted in the room after that. The guards felt it too. Valora's jaw tightened almost invisibly as she stared into the human's exhausted blue eyes. No hatred, no panic, somehow, no fear. That disturbed her more than defiance ever could. Warning sirens suddenly pulsed through the corridor outside the chamber. Red lights flickered harder now. Faster. A ship-wide announcement crackled overhead in the Carvax language. Valora barely glanced toward the ceiling speaker before returning her attention to Ethan. You should fear me, she said quietly. Ethan leaned his head back against the restraint frame with a weak grin. Funny thing about humans, he whispered. We grew up on a planet that tried killing us every single day. For the first time since entering the chamber, General Valora Threx felt cold. The medical base smelled like ozone, antiseptic foam, and overheated metal. Thin streams of blue light slid across the curved ceiling as diagnostic drones floated silently between rows of glowing containment pods. Outside the armored viewport, stars stretched endlessly across the black vacuum, while the massive Carvax battleship drifted through a debris field left behind by the war near the Orion Fringe. Ethan Cole sat restrained against a reinforced examination chair in the center of the room, his wrists locked inside magnetic cuffs designed for creatures twice his size. A thermal blanket rested loosely over his shoulders, though it did little to hide the bruises spreading beneath his pale skin. One of the alien medics adjusted a scanner over Ethan's chest and recoiled slightly when the screen flashed red again. "This cannot be correct," the medic whispered. "His skeletal structure shows microfractures consistent with battlefield collapse trauma, yet his nervous system is compensating without sedation." Another medic rotated the holographic display between four clawed fingers. Internal body temperature remained stable at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit despite prolonged environmental stress. Ethan cracked one eye open and gave a tired smirk. "Good genes." The medics exchanged uneasy glances. One quietly backed away from him altogether. Across the room, General Valora Threx stood near the observation console with her arms folded behind her back. She had removed the upper half of her combat armor after returning from the interrogation chamber, revealing dark blue skin marked with silver military insignias burned directly into her shoulders. Her golden eyes followed every number scrolling across the diagnostic screen. Human respiration rates, adrenal responses, cellular regeneration. None of it aligned with accepted galactic biology standards. "Display planetary origin data," Valora ordered calmly. The holographic projector shifted instantly. Earth appeared above the examination table as a rotating blue sphere surrounded by streams of classified Federation information. Atmospheric instability, violent tectonic activity, extreme predator density, viral ecosystems, seasonal disasters, nuclear conflict history, gravity index, 1.0 standard crush force. One of the younger officers stared at the data in disbelief. "No advanced species should have evolved there," he muttered. "The planet itself is hostile to intelligent life." Ethan slowly lifted his head toward the projection overhead. Even exhausted, there was something strangely calm in his expression when he looked at Earth. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That sounds about right." Valora stepped closer. "Your species calls that world home willingly." Ethan let out a weak laugh. "Lady, people on Earth pay money to climb freezing mountains just to take pictures." Silence settled across the room again. One medic cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "General, his pain receptors remain active. Fully active. He should not be conscious." Valora studied Ethan for a long moment before finally asking, "Why are you still resisting?" Ethan looked at her through strands of damp brown hair falling over his forehead. "Because surviving is what humans do." The answer irritated her more than it should have. No arrogance. No dramatic speech. Just simple certainty. Like gravity. Like breathing. Valora turned back toward the holographic Earth rotating slowly above them. Massive oceans. Storm systems larger than continents. Endless conflict markers covering entire hemispheres. A death world. The term suddenly felt too small. Ethan shifted slightly against the restraints, wincing as metal creaked beneath the pressure of his movement. One of the medics flinched again. "General," the officer whispered carefully. "Permission to sedate the prisoner before further examination?" Valora remained silent for several seconds. Then she surprised everyone in the room. "No sedation." The medics froze. "But General, prolonged stress exposure could damage his cognition permanently." Ethan gave a dry chuckle. "Buddy, Earth already did that years ago." A few soldiers near the doorway made uncomfortable clicking noises again. Valora ignored them. Her gaze remained fixed on the human sitting beneath the cold medical lights. Broken ribs, elevated pulse, exhaustion written across every inch of his face. Yet somehow the room still felt smaller. Around him, as if the prisoner was the most dangerous thing aboard the entire ship. And for reasons she could not explain, General Valora Threx was beginning to believe it. The isolation chamber was colder than deep space. Frost crawled slowly across the black metal walls while thin streams of vapor drifted from hidden vents in the ceiling. Every surface glowed with pale blue emergency lighting that turned the room into something halfway between a laboratory and a tomb. Ethan Cole sat alone inside the center restraint frame with his arms secured above shoulder level, heavy magnetic cuffs humming softly around his wrists. A digital temperature display near the doorway blinked steadily at -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Human skin was not supposed to survive prolonged exposure like this without thermal gear, at least according to Carvax science. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching white vapor leave his mouth. His fingers had already gone numb hours ago. His shoulders ached from exhaustion. Every breath scraped against his chest like broken glass. But somewhere beneath the pain, his body had entered that strange survival rhythm humans understood too well. Endure. Adjust. Keep breathing. The chamber door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. General Valora Threx stepped inside accompanied by two armored officers carrying neural monitoring equipment. Her long dark cape moved behind her like flowing shadow against the frozen floor. Temperature exposure entering fatal range, one officer reported quietly. Most species lose consciousness within 17 minutes. Ethan lifted his head slightly. Good thing I am from Chicago. The officer frowned in confusion. Valora did not react outwardly, but she noticed something impossible again. The human's speech remained coherent. His pulse remained elevated but stable. Even now, with frost gathering along the edges of his hair and restrained frame, his eyes still tracked movement clearly. Increase environmental pressure, Valora ordered. The room answered instantly. A deep mechanical vibration rolled through the chamber floor as gravity generators activated inside the walls. Ethan's body tightened against the restraints as the pressure intensified around him. The metal beneath his boots groaned softly. 1.2 standard gravity, then 1.4, then 1.6. Enough to immobilize most galactic infantry species. Ethan clenched his jaw hard enough for muscle to twitch beneath the skin of his face. Sweat formed despite the freezing temperature. His breathing slowed deliberately. Controlled. Measured. Valora stepped closer, studying him carefully. Your body should be failing. Ethan forced one eye open toward her. Funny thing about humans, he muttered through strained breaths. We say that a lot too. The younger officer beside her looked disturbed now. General, this pressure exceeds military prisoner protocols. Valora ignored him. Her attention remained entirely fixed on the human restrained before her. There was no dramatic resistance. No roaring defiance. That almost unsettled her more. Ethan simply endured it. Quietly. Like survival itself, had become instinct. Minutes passed beneath the crushing pressure. Frost melted against Ethan's skin from body heat alone before freezing again along the restraint cables. Finally, one of the neural monitors emitted a warning tone. Adrenal response spike detected, the medic said nervously. His body is adapting. Valora turned sharply. Adapting? Yes, General. His muscle fibers are compensating under environmental stress. Ethan suddenly let out a low laugh that echoed weakly through the chamber. Back home, he breathed. High school wrestling practice felt worse than this. One officer stared at him in disbelief. What kind of planet trains children under crushing gravity? Ethan looked up slowly toward the frosted ceiling. The kind trying to toughen them up before adulthood. Silence spread through the room again. Outside the chamber viewport, stars drifted silently beyond the warship hull. Inside, only the sound of Ethan's breathing remained. Valora studied him for several long seconds before speaking again. Why do humans continue enduring suffering beyond reason? Ethan closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion finally bleeding through his expression. When he answered, his voice sounded quieter now. Honest. Because. Eventually, he whispered, somebody else is counting on you to survive it. Something inside Valora shifted at those words. Small. Unwelcome. But real. And for the first time since capturing the human prisoner, General Valora Threx found herself unable to decide whether Ethan Cole was a threat to her empire, or to everything she thought she understood about strength. Sleep never truly existed aboard a Carvax warship. The ship groaned constantly around its crew like some enormous mechanical predator drifting through deep space. Pipes hissed behind steel walls. Engines pulsed beneath the floor, plating with slow, rhythmic vibrations that could be felt through bone. Somewhere far below the command deck, fighter squadrons launched into the darkness every few hours, their thrusters briefly illuminating the observation windows with streaks of blue fire. General Valora Threx stood alone inside her private strategy chamber, watching Earth rotate silently across a suspended holographic projector. Oceans, storm fronts, wild weather systems colliding across entire continents. A world that looked beautiful from orbit and lethal from the surface. Her clawed fingers moved through streams of classified Federation records hovering in the air around her. Human military history, survival statistics, environmental adaptability reports. Every file made less sense than the last. Nuclear wars followed by reconstruction. Economic collapse followed by expansion. Disease outbreaks survived through sheer persistence. Even their recreational activities appeared irrational. Humans voluntarily entered frozen water, climbed unstable mountains, competed in endurance events until their bodies collapsed. It was madness disguised as culture. The chamber doors opened softly behind her. Commander Relk stepped inside, carrying a data tablet against his armored chest. "General," he said carefully, "the prisoner remains awake." Veolora did not turn around. "How long has it been?" 31 hours without meaningful rest. Relk hesitated before continuing. Medical staff attempted sensory suppression protocols. The human began singing. Veolora slowly looked over her shoulder. "Singing?" "Yes, General." The commander sounded uncomfortable even saying it aloud. Primitive military chants. Rhythmic patterns. He maintained cognitive function throughout the procedure. For several seconds, Veolora said nothing. She simply studied the holographic Earth spinning above the table while distant stars glimmered through the viewport behind it. "Bring me the recording," she ordered quietly. Minutes later, the strategy chamber filled with distorted audio from the interrogation block. Static crackled softly beneath the sound of Ethan Cole's exhausted voice. Low, rough, barely above a whisper, yet steady somehow. The words were old Earth military lyrics about marching through storms and bringing soldiers home alive. Veolora listened in silence while the recording continued. No screaming, no begging, just a tired human voice echoing through cold metal corridors. Commander Relk shifted uneasily beside her. "We increased neural pressure twice during the session," he explained. The prisoner responded by slowing his breathing manually. "He appears capable of regulating panic responses under extreme stress." Veolora muted the recording. "Not panic," she said quietly. "Control." Relk frowned. "General?" She finally turned toward him fully. "He is not enduring because he lacks fear. He is enduring because he was taught how to survive it." The commander remained silent after that. Outside the viewport, fragments of destroyed warships drifted slowly through the void like frozen skeletons beneath distant starlight. Veolora crossed the chamber and stopped beside another holographic display showing Ethan restrained in the isolation room. Exhausted, injured, barely conscious. Yet even asleep for those few brief minutes, his hands remained partially clenched as if his body refused to lower its guard completely. "There is more," Relk said carefully. During equipment maintenance, one of the younger technicians slipped inside the lower reactor corridor. The coolant vent ruptured. Veolora glanced toward him sharply. "Casualties?" "None." Relk swallowed. "The prisoner warned them before the pressure seal burst." Veolora stared at him. "Explain." He heard the instability in the pipe. Vibrations through the wall. Human auditory sensitivity appears significantly higher under stress conditions. The commander paused again. He shielded the technician from the vent discharge before security restraints fully activated. Silence settled heavily across the chamber. Veolora slowly looked back toward the image of Ethan resting against the restraint frame beneath freezing blue lights. "Why?" she asked softly. Relk looked genuinely confused. "General, why would a prisoner protect enemy personnel?" The commander had no answer. Neither did she. And somehow that unsettled General Veolora threats more than all the human endurance reports combined. The lower reactor corridor trembled with deep mechanical vibrations as coolant turbines cycled beneath the warship's armored spine. Emergency lights flashed slowly overhead, bathing the narrow passage in alternating red and shadow while steam drifted from cracked maintenance vents along the walls. The air smelled metallic and hot despite the freezing temperatures maintained near the reactor core. Ethan Cole sat restrained against a magnetic transport frame outside the engineering junction while two Carvax guards monitored him from several feet away. Heavy energy cuffs remained locked around his wrists and ankles, glowing faintly blue every time he shifted his weight. One guard kept a pulse rifle trained loosely in Ethan's direction while the other checked a diagnostic scanner with growing frustration. "The prisoner should not require direct observation during system repairs," the younger guard muttered. "General Threx specifically ordered it." The older one replied without looking up. Ethan leaned his head back against the steel wall behind him, eyes half closed. Exhaustion hung visibly across his face now. 36 hours of exposure protocols and interrogation cycles had finally slowed him down physically, but there was still something infuriatingly calm about him. Something unbroken, The corridor suddenly echoed with a sharp metallic screech. Ethan's eyes opened immediately. His expression changed at once. Focused. Alert. He slowly turned toward the reactor conduit running along the left side of the corridor. Wall. Another sound followed. Subtle. Almost impossible to notice beneath the engine vibrations. A faint, irregular clicking buried deep inside the coolant pipes. Ethan frowned. Hey, he said quietly. Neither guard reacted. The clicking sound grew sharper. Ethan sat upright against the restraint frame. Hey, he repeated louder. That pipe is about to rupture. The younger guard scoffed. Remain silent, human. Ethan stared directly at the coolant line. Years of combat deployments aboard unstable Earth carriers suddenly flashed through muscle memory and instinct. Pressure fluctuation. Thermal imbalance. Metal fatigue. He knew the sound. Move. Ethan snapped suddenly. Now. The older guard finally looked toward the conduit, just as warning symbols exploded across the nearby engineering console. A violent burst of steam erupted from the wall with a deafening hiss. Superheated coolant vapor blasted into the corridor, sending one of the younger maintenance technicians stumbling backward directly into the rupture zone. The guards froze in shock for half a second too long. Ethan did not. He threw his entire body sideways despite the restraints locking his arms behind the frame. The transport rig crashed hard against the floor as Ethan twisted between the technician and the burst pipe, shielding the smaller alien with his own body while boiling vapor exploded across the corridor. Emergency alarms screamed instantly overhead. Thick white steam swallowed everything. The magnetic restraints sparked violently against the impact. Several seconds later, emergency pressure doors slammed shut throughout the corridor with a thunderous boom. Silence followed except for the hiss of leaking coolant and the crackling of damaged circuitry. Security teams rushed into the smoke-filled corridor moments later with rifles raised. What they found stopped them cold. Ethan lay against the floor beside the overturned restraint frame, breathing heavily while steam curled from his burned prison uniform. The young alien technician remained alive beneath him, terrified but unharmed. Ethan coughed roughly before looking toward the stunned guards nearby. Told you, he rasped. Bad pipe. Minutes. Later, General Valora Threx arrived personally. Her armored boots splashed through coolant runoff as she stepped into the damaged corridor. Engineers immediately straightened at attention. No one spoke. Valora's golden eyes moved across the destruction before finally landing on Ethan. The human sat against the wall now while medics examined his injuries under flickering emergency lights. Exhaustion carved deep lines across his face, but when he noticed her approaching, he still managed a weak smile. You guys seriously need better maintenance crews, he muttered. Valora ignored the comment. Her gaze shifted slowly toward the trembling young technician standing nearby. Alive because of the prisoner. Enemy personnel. Saved without hesitation. Without reward. Without logic. The technician lowered his head toward Ethan in visible gratitude. Ethan simply nodded once like it was nothing. That unsettled Valora more than the reactor rupture itself. She stepped closer until she stood directly in front of him. You protected one of my crew, she said quietly. Ethan shrugged carefully despite the pain visible in his posture. Kid was standing in the wrong place. He is your enemy. Ethan looked up at her beneath the flashing red lights. Yeah, he said softly. Still did not want him dead. The corridor fell silent again after that. Somewhere deep inside the warship, engines continued rumbling through the darkness of space. But for the first time in many years, General Valora Threx found herself staring at a human prisoner and questioning whether strength without compassion had ever truly been strength at all. The warship drifted silently above the shattered moon of Varkesh Prime, while thousands of pieces of destroyed cruisers floated through the darkness like broken glass beneath distant starlight. Inside the command deck, tactical holograms illuminated the massive chamber in cold blue light. Fleet officers moved between glowing consoles while navigational data scrolled endlessly across suspended screens overhead. Yet despite the constant activity, an uneasy tension lingered beneath every conversation now. Word about the human prisoner had spread through the ship, faster than military protocol could contain it. The Deathworlder who survived interrogation cycles. The prisoner who warned engineers about the coolant rupture. The human who protected enemy crew members while restrained. General Valora Threx stood near the panoramic observation window with her hands clasped behind her back as stars reflected faintly across her golden eyes. Behind her, several senior commanders argued quietly around the tactical table. "The prisoner is manipulating morale," one officer insisted. "The crew has begun discussing him as if he were some mythical predator." Another commander slammed a clawed hand against the console. "Then execute him publicly. End this nonsense immediately." Veolora remained silent. Her attention stayed fixed on the stars outside the warship hull, while engine vibrations pulsed gently through the floor beneath her boots. Finally, Commander Relk approached carefully from behind. "General," he said quietly, "the prisoner requested water for the injured reactor technician." Veolora turned slightly. "Requested?" Relk nodded once. His exact words were, "Kid looked shaken up. Somebody should check on him." A strange stillness settled across the room after that. One of the older admirals scoffed openly. "Primitive emotional weakness," he muttered. "Humans protect anything that breathes. It makes them predictable." Veolora slowly faced the tactical table. "Predictable?" she asked calmly. "A restrained prisoner endangered himself to save one of our crew members without expectation of survival." No one answered immediately. The admiral folded his arms defensively. "Compassion is irrelevant in war." Veolora's expression hardened slightly. "Then why are our soldiers afraid of him?" Silence followed. Deep. Uncomfortable. Across the chamber, holographic combat reports continued scrolling through the air untouched. Human casualty projections. Carvax fleet losses. Endless numbers measuring destruction with cold mathematical precision. Veolora suddenly felt exhausted by all of it. Hours later, she descended alone into the lower detention block. The corridor lights dimmed automatically as she approached the isolated holding chamber. Inside, Ethan Cole sat against the far wall beneath soft blue security lights, one knee pulled loosely against his chest, while medical wraps covered his shoulders and arms. For the first time since his capture, the restraints around his wrists had been reduced to a lighter security bind. Ethan looked up as the chamber door opened. "Let me guess," he said tiredly. "You finally came to throw me out an airlock." Veolora stepped inside slowly. "If I intended your death, you would already be gone." Ethan gave a weak nod. "Fair point." The chamber fell quiet except for the low electrical hum of the security field surrounding the room. Veolora studied him carefully in the silence. Exhausted, injured, yet somehow calmer than most soldiers under her command. "Why did you protect the technician?" she finally asked. Ethan looked down briefly at his hands before answering. "Because he was scared. He serves your enemy." "Yeah." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Still a person." Veolora frowned slightly at the unfamiliar phrase. "Your species extends empathy even toward hostile forces?" Ethan leaned his head back against the wall. "Look, General, humans are good at surviving ugly places. We always have been." His tired blue eyes lifted toward hers again beneath the dim chamber lights. "But survival alone is not what kept us alive." Veolora remained motionless. Ethan exhaled slowly before continuing. "We survive because eventually somebody chooses to protect somebody else." The words settled heavily inside the quiet detention chamber. No speeches, no dramatic declaration. Just simple truth spoken by a half-exhausted human sitting on a cold steel floor. Veolora stared at him for several long seconds before realizing something deeply unsettling. Every interrogation protocol aboard her warship had failed for one reason. They had spent days trying to understand why humans endured suffering. But they had been asking the wrong question all along. The real answer was far more dangerous. Humans did not endure because they loved pain. They endured because they refused to abandon each other. The alarm sirens began at 2:17 ship time. Deep metallic pulses thundered through the warship. Corridors as red emergency lights flooded every deck in violent waves of crimson. Crew members rushed between stations while automated defense systems activated overhead with sharp mechanical clicks. Somewhere far below the command levels, an explosion rolled through the ship hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling panels inside the detention block. Ethan Cole opened his eyes instantly. Years of military reflexes dragged him awake before the second alarm cycle even finished. The detention chamber flickered between darkness and red emergency lighting while the security field around the room sputtered unevenly. Ethan slowly pushed himself upright against the steel wall, exhaustion still weighing heavily through every muscle in his body. Then he heard it. Not battle outside the ship. Inside. Rapid plasma fire echoed faintly through the corridor beyond the chamber door, followed by shouting in the Carvax language. Ethan frowned immediately. "That is not good," he muttered. The overhead speaker crackled violently. "All command personnel report to defensive positions. Unauthorized fleet elements have seized decks 4 through 7. Ethan blinked once. "Oh, that is really not good." Outside the detention corridor, armored soldiers sprinted past the chamber entrance carrying rifles and emergency equipment. One of them stopped briefly near the security console, his face pale beneath the flickering lights. Ethan recognized the young reactor technician from earlier. The alien looked terrified. "What happened?" Ethan called through the field barrier. The technician hesitated before answering quietly. "Several admirals initiated command override protocols. They accused General Threx of compromising military doctrine because of you." Ethan let out a tired sigh and leaned his head back against the wall. "Yeah, that tracks." Another explosion rumbled through the ship. Emergency lights dimmed for half a second before backup generators restored power again. Somewhere overhead, the sound of metal twisting echoed through the corridors like distant thunder. The young technician glanced nervously behind him. "They are coming for the detention block next," he whispered. "The admirals want you transferred to Weapons Research Division." Ethan stared at him for a moment. "Kid," he said carefully, "that sounds way worse than execution." The technician lowered his head slightly. "General Threx opposed the order." Ethan suddenly went quiet. Before he could respond, the corridor doors at the far end burst open. General Veolora Threx stormed through the smoke-filled hallway surrounded by loyal security forces. Her dark blue armor reflected the emergency lights like moving fire, while a long scorch mark crossed one shoulder plate from recent combat. "Seal this corridor immediately," she ordered sharply. "Rebel units are advancing from the command deck." Security teams moved instantly. Heavy blast doors slammed shut throughout the detention sector, while warning sirens screamed overhead. Veolora crossed directly toward Ethan's containment chamber without slowing. Their eyes met through the unstable security field. "Please tell me this is your people rescuing me," Ethan said. Veolora ignored the joke. "Several members of the High Fleet Council have seized tactical control of the ship," she said coldly. "They intend to dissect you for military analysis." Ethan stared at her. "See? Knew it sounded worse." Another violent impact shook the detention block. Sparks erupted from the ceiling as emergency systems struggled to maintain power. Then the security field surrounding Ethan's chamber flickered dangerously weak. One of Veolora's officers stepped forward urgently. "General, rebel forces breached the lower armory. We cannot hold both sectors." Veolora looked toward the failing energy barrier around Ethan. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly as calculations moved behind them. Duty, logic, protocol. Everything her empire had taught her pointed toward one answer. Leave the prisoner behind. Preserve command authority. Yet all she could hear in that moment was the exhausted human voice from hours earlier. Humans survive because they refuse to abandon each other. The chamber lights flickered again. Veolora made her decision. She stepped toward the security console beside Ethan's cell and placed her hand against the override panel. Several officers froze in disbelief. "General," one whispered carefully. Veolora's voice remained perfectly calm. "Unlock the prisoner." Ethan's eyes widened slightly as the restraints around his wrists disengaged with a heavy metallic click for the first time since his capture. Blood rushed painfully back through his hands while the weakened security field dissolved into sparks around him. Veolora looked directly at the human standing slowly inside the chamber. "You once said humans survive by protecting each other," she said quietly over the sound of distant explosions. Ethan rubbed his wrists carefully before meeting her gaze. "Yeah." Veolora handed him a plasma sidearm. "Then survive with us." The plasma sidearm felt strangely light in Ethan Cole's hand after days in restraints. Familiar, comfortable, like muscle memory waking up beneath bruised skin and exhaustion. Around him, the detention corridor shook violently as another explosion thundered somewhere above the command decks. Emergency lights flashed across drifting smoke while sparks rained intermittently from damaged ceiling panels. Carvax soldiers rushed into defensive positions along the corridor walls, weapons raised toward the sealed blast doors at the far end. Ethan flexed his fingers once around the grip of the alien weapon and frowned slightly. "Safety placement on this thing is terrible," he muttered. One of the nearby officers stared at him in disbelief. "You have never handled Carvax military equipment before." Ethan checked the energy chamber instinctively. Gun is still a gun. General Valora Threx stood near the center barricade while tactical reports streamed rapidly across a damaged holographic display beside her. Rebel fleet units had already seized nearly 40% of the warship. Internal communications were collapsing deck by deck. Loyalist forces were falling back toward engineering and navigation sectors. The ship was dying from the inside. Then the blast doors exploded inward. Smoke and debris flooded the corridor as rebel soldiers surged through the opening under flashing red emergency lights. Plasma fire streaked across the hallway instantly. Karvak's troops returned fire from behind, overturned cargo barriers while warning sirens screamed overhead loud enough to shake the walls. Ethan moved without thinking. Pure instinct. Years of survival training from a planet where hesitation often meant death. He grabbed the terrified young reactor technician beside him and pulled the smaller alien behind reinforced piping just before a shower of sparks erupted across the corridor floor. "Stay down," Ethan snapped, "and breathe slower." Valora glanced toward him briefly in the middle of the chaos. For the first time since capturing the human, she saw him outside restraints. Not broken, not helpless, dangerous, not because of rage, because of control. Ethan advanced beside the Loyalist soldiers through drifting smoke, movements sharp despite exhaustion weighing visibly on his body. Every step looked painful now. His shoulders remained wrapped in fresh medical bandages beneath the torn prison uniform. Yet somehow he kept moving anyway. Rebel forces pushed aggressively through the corridor junction ahead. Ethan spotted a damaged pressure seal sparking above the hallway intersection and immediately pointed toward it. "Everybody move left," he shouted. "That door is about to blow." Several Karvak's soldiers hesitated in confusion. Valora did not. "Move," she commanded instantly. Loyalist troops shifted positions seconds before the overloaded pressure conduit burst outward in a violent spray of steam and collapsing metal that blocked the rebel advance entirely. One officer stared at Ethan in disbelief. "How did you know that?" Ethan exhaled hard, leaning briefly against the wall for support. "Because ships all break the same way." The corridor trembled again. Somewhere deeper inside the vessel, another section of the warship lost atmospheric pressure. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut automatically throughout nearby decks with thunderous force. Through the smoke-filled hallway, Ethan suddenly noticed one of the rebel soldiers trapped beneath a collapsed support beam. Young, injured, terrified, barely more than a recruit. Ethan immediately moved toward him. A Loyalist officer grabbed his arm. "Leave him," the soldier barked. "He is enemy personnel." Ethan looked at the trapped alien for half a second before answering quietly. "Yeah, still breathing though." Before anyone could stop him, Ethan crossed the corridor under flickering red lights and helped pull the trapped soldier free from the damaged support beam. The young rebel stared at him in complete shock. "Why?" the alien whispered. Ethan adjusted the soldier's arm carefully before stepping back toward the Loyalist line. "Because somebody probably wants you home alive." Silence spread briefly across both sides of the corridor after that. Even the surviving rebel soldiers hesitated now, uncertain what they were looking at anymore. Valora watched Ethan through drifting smoke and flashing emergency lights, while distant explosions echoed through the dying warship around them. Days ago she had seen him as a dangerous Deathworld specimen, then as a prisoner, then as a military anomaly. But now, standing in the middle of chaos while helping both allies and enemies survive, Ethan Cole looked like something far more unsettling. Proof that the true strength of humanity had never been endurance alone. It was the impossible refusal to lose compassion even inside a war. By the time the fighting ended, the Karvak's warship barely resembled a functioning vessel anymore. Entire sections of the command decks remained dark without power while emergency bulkheads sealed off damaged corridors throughout the ship. Smoke drifted slowly through shattered ventilation shafts. Small fires crackled behind broken wall panels, casting weak orange reflections across twisted metal floors. Outside the observation windows, the stars remained cold and silent above the ruined moon of Varkesh Prime as debris from the failed mutiny floated endlessly through space. The surviving rebel officers had surrendered 3 hours earlier, some because their command structure collapsed, others because they no longer understood what they were fighting for. Ethan Cole sat alone near the forward observation chamber with his back resting against the curved steel wall beneath the viewport. Someone had finally given him proper medical treatment, though the fresh bandages wrapping his shoulders and ribs already showed signs of strain beneath the dim lighting. Exhaustion hung over him completely now, the kind that settled into bone after too many days without rest. Yet despite everything, his breathing had finally slowed into something peaceful. For the first time since his capture, nobody pointed a weapon at him anymore. Soft footsteps echoed through the chamber behind him. Ethan looked up slowly as General Valora Threx entered alone. She had removed most of her battle armor. Without it, she somehow looked less like a feared war commander and more like someone carrying the weight of an entire collapsing world on her shoulders. A long fracture line crossed one of the silver insignias burned into her dark blue skin where debris had struck during the mutiny. Ethan noticed immediately. "You are bleeding, General," he said quietly. Valora glanced down briefly at the injury before looking back toward the stars outside the viewport. "It is insignificant." Ethan gave a tired half-smile. That is usually how bad injuries start. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The warship hummed weakly around them, while distant repair crews worked somewhere deeper inside the vessel. Valora finally stepped closer to the viewport beside him. Reflections of drifting stars shimmered faintly across her golden eyes. "The High Fleet Council has issued new orders," she said softly. "You are no longer classified as a military prisoner." Ethan blinked once in surprise. "That is probably the nicest thing anybody has told me all week." A faint sound escaped Valora then. Small, quiet, almost unfamiliar. It took Ethan a second to realize she had laughed. Very slightly, Valora lowered her gaze toward the damaged deck beneath them. "Several officers requested your execution after the mutiny," she admitted. Others argued for research containment. Ethan sighed heavily. "Let me guess. You disagreed." Valora remained silent for several seconds before answering. "I informed them that if humanity can produce soldiers willing to protect even their enemies, then perhaps your species is not the threat we believed." Ethan looked toward her carefully after that. No arrogance. No victory. Just exhaustion and honesty. "Humans are definitely still a threat sometimes," he muttered. "We are just trying real hard not to be." Another quiet silence settled between them. Beyond the viewport, the stars stretched endlessly across the darkness, while pieces of destroyed warships drifted like ghosts through the void. Valora slowly sat down beside him against the steel wall, close enough now that Ethan could hear the controlled rhythm of her breathing beneath the silence. "All my life," she said quietly, "I believed strength meant domination, endurance, fear." Her golden eyes lifted toward the stars again. "But you endured everything the ship inflicted upon you, and still chose kindness." Ethan stared forward for a long moment before answering. "On Earth, surviving alone is easy for a little while." He glanced toward her beside him beneath the dim observation lights. "Staying human while you survive is the hard part." Valora lowered her head slightly after hearing that. For the first time since Ethan Cole boarded the Carvax warship in chains, General Valora Threx no longer saw a Deathworld monster sitting beside her. She saw something far more dangerous to the galaxy's understanding of power. A man exhausted beyond reason who still believed compassion mattered more than fear. Outside the viewport, the distant stars reflected softly across her eyes. And for the first time in her life, they no longer looked cold.